Hi, this is Pastor Josh. Thank you for joining us on our Wednesday night study as we are examining verse by verse the Old Testament. We are in the midst of 1 Samuel chapter 14. We have seen King Saul disobey God, have the hand of the Lord, the Spirit of the Lord removed from Saul because of his direct disobedience. And then Jonathan, his son, went out and, along with his armor bearer, struck a great blow against the Philistines. So now here we are in 1 Samuel chapter 14, beginning in verse 16. And the watchmen of Saul in Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude was dispersing here and there. Then Saul said to the people who were with him, "Count and see who has gone from us." And when they counted, behold, Jonathan and his armor bearer were not there. Now, naturally, Saul would have had men watching the Philistines for any kind of troop movements in hopes of giving them advanced warning that they had been discovered in their cave. The watchmen saw that all of a sudden the Philistine forces were seen running indiscriminately for their lives. So the watchmen, who were so keen and aware of the Philistines, they had missed Jonathan and his armor bearer leaving the cave out on their own. This is very indicative of the stark differences between Saul and Jonathan. Saul was content to watch what might happen, but Jonathan followed the Lord to make something happen. When the word of the retreating Philistines, makes it back to Saul, he makes a remarkably astute observation. It seemed to him that possibly some of his men may have been the very reason for the fleeing Philistines. They could have been fleeing because of some outside third-party intervention, but before he would believe that, he wanted to check his own army because that was the easiest thing to check first. So they did a roll call right there in the cave to see whose battalion had gone out to the Philistines. And it was discovered that rather than a whole battalion, it was just Jonathan and his armor bearer who were not in the cave. Verse 18. So Saul said to Ahijah, "Bring the ark of God here." For the ark of God went at that time with the people of Israel. Now while Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the camp of the Philistines increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, "Withdraw your hand." Then Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and went into the battle. And behold, every Philistine sword was against his fellow, and there was very great confusion. So with the discovery of the missing prince and armor bearer, Saul attempts to seek the Lord's direction about his next course of action. Deuteronomy 20 instructs Israel to always seek the Lord before going into battle. The last time that Saul had acted without the Lord had been devastating. So they bring out the ark, which they have with them in the cave in an effort to hear from the Lord. The ark is brought, and the priest is brought near to try to figure out what God would have them do. Then the command to the priest to withdraw his hand is not quite what you would expect to hear at this point. They were not allowed to simply touch the ark to try to divine an answer from the Lord. So, from what could Saul be referring to Ahijah withdrawing his hand? If you look back at verse 3, you see that a note is given here about Ahijah wearing an ephod. The ephod had a compartment that contained the Urim and the Thummim, which were holy lots that would be cast and guided by the Holy Spirit. So then it would make sense for Saul to tell Ahijah to withdraw his hand if Ahijah had reached into the compartment to pull out the Urim and the Thummim. But notice that Saul instructs Ahijah to withdraw his hand, and then Saul tells the people what to do. So they have not yet sought the Lord for direction about how they are to go into battle. It seems as though Saul stops Ahijah from pulling out the Urim and the Thummim, and then he goes on and makes his own decision about what they should do next. Now, what do you think stopped Saul from completing the act of seeking the Lord? He had started, so why did he stop? Maybe he saw that his opportunity for victory was slipping out of his hands at that very second, every second that they waited. So they stopped seeking the Lord, and they went ahead and jumped into action. And with their action, the Philistines were driven into total confusion, and they began to kill each other, undoubtedly thinking that they were the Israelites. Look at verse 21. Now the Hebrews who had been with the Philistines before that time and who had gone up with them into the camp, even they also turned to be with the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. Likewise, all the men of Israel who had hidden themselves in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were fleeing. They too followed hard after them in the battle. So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle passed beyond Bethaven. So apparently, there had been some Israelites who seemingly had defeated, or who had defected to the Philistines. When they became aware that the Philistines were fleeing because of the Israelites, they turned on their asylum granters and started fighting against them. It's interesting that this group of people specifically seemed to be willing to be loyal to whomever is winning at the moment. Kind of like a person rooting for whichever sports team is winning and most popular at the moment. Maybe they only defected out of fear of being killed, and maybe they genuinely returned to fight for Israel out of a faithful loyalty. These could have been the reasons that it appeared the Philistines were fighting themselves, these defectors turning back to Israel. The passage also reveals that there were other Israelites hiding among the hills of the Ephraimite region. These guys were also watching the troop movements of the Philistines, and when they saw the chaotic retreat, they jumped at the chance to join the battle. Saul and Jonathan had thought that they only had 600 men left, but when the Lord joined the battle, he brought help from everywhere. The extra help came from the most unexpected places, from among the very Philistine ranks, and from the seeming ground of Ephraim. When faced with opposition, especially overwhelming opposition, the Lord can bring help from anywhere that he wants. So our perception of our resources means nothing when God shows up in power. Notice also that the Lord here is given credit for the victory that day. And the Lord is the one who saved Israel, even though Saul did not seek him out. Jonathan had sought the Lord and had full faith in the Lord's plan, even if it meant death for himself. Jonathan's faith was in the Lord, not in the ease of his situation. Verse 24. And the men of Israel had been hard-pressed that day, so Saul had laid an oath on the people, saying, "Cursed be the man who eats food until it is evening, and I am avenged on my enemies." So none of the people had tasted food. Now, Scripture does not require fasting during a battle, but Saul makes a rash vow that was incredibly ill-advised in a similar fashion to Jephthah from the book of Judges. We should never be in such a rush that we speak out of turn and speak for God when God did not speak. Maybe Saul thought that he would spark further zeal in his men by making this vow. Maybe he thought that he would find favor in the Lord's eyes, forcing his men to keep fighting until the fight was won. Whatever his personal reasoning, Saul made it punishable for any of his men to eat anything while there was still fighting to do. He neglected to think about the undue hardship that he was placing on his men. They would be fighting all day without any kind of sustenance or nutrition. They were constantly using up energy without any means of replenishing it. The army obeyed Saul for fear of the fulfillment of his oath, but that resulted in devastating effects on all of them. Verse 25. Now, when all the people came to the forest, behold, there was honey on the ground. And when the people entered the forest, behold, the honey was dropping, but no one put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard his father charge the people with the oath. So he put out the tip of his staff that was in his hand and dipped it in the honeycomb and put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes became bright. How difficult would it have been for the men to resist temptation that day, the temptation of the honey? They were undoubtedly exhausted and incredibly hungry from all the running, from all the fighting. And honey was everywhere. It was all over the ground. Here it says it was even so plentiful, it was dripping, probably from the trees above. Sweet food is literally falling from the sky all around them and probably on them, and yet no one ate anything for fear of what might happen to them if they succumb to the temptation to eat. It is important for what will happen in a minute, but notice that the men are afraid of Saul keeping the oath that he had made. Then there's Jonathan here, strolling through the forest, still fighting alongside the newly arrived army. He had started the battle. He had not been at the cave with the rest of the army when Saul shouted the oath. So Jonathan would not have known to hold his hand back from any potential food that he might come across. Now, my immediate reaction in reading this, my immediate question is, were there no other men around Jonathan at this time? Was no one there to warn Jonathan when they saw him reach out his staff and saw him take the honey to his mouth? Well, it turns out that there were people around who did in fact see him eating the honey. Verse 28. Then one of the people said, "Your father strictly charged the people with an oath, saying, 'Cursed be the man who eats food this day.' And the people were faint." Then Jonathan said, "My father has troubled the land. See how my eyes have become bright because I tasted a little of this honey. How much better if the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies that they found. For now the defeat among the Philistines has not been great." So one of the soldiers comes up to Jonathan and tells him about the cursed oath that the king had made to the army. Then the passage here, it reveals that the army wasn't simply hungry. They were so famished that they were faint. And Jonathan says out loud a statement of negativity about his father's authority, questioning his wisdom about such a decision. He says that his father has caused some great problems for the people, and then he gives himself as an example of how wrong his father had been. Then he goes even further as to say, what would have been much better for the king a much better decision for the king to have made. You know, these kind of statements by some could be taken as treasonous as they question the ability of the king to make good decisions. Jonathan very heavily implies that he would have made a completely different decision if he would have been king, and his decision would have been so much better. It seems that Jonathan was making the statement to no one in particular, as there's a generalized sentence here in between the reveal of the oath and his questioning statement. However, it could easily be read as Jonathan making his statement to the soldier who told him about the cursed oath. That would have been so much worse. If indeed Jonathan were telling another soldier how bad of a decision maker the king is, Jonathan here, even though they had won the battle, he says that it was a bitter victory because of how weak the army had become. The army had been more fearful of Saul and his oath than they were celebrating and joyful over the victory of the Lord. Jonathan is merely pointing out how wrong that really is. They had won the battle, so they should be praising the Lord. But instead, they were all seemingly collapsing from weakness. Look at verse 31. They struck down the Philistines that day from Michmash to Aijalon. And the people were very faint. The people pounced on the spoil and took sheep and oxen and calves and slaughtered them on the ground, and the people ate them with the blood. Then they told Saul, "Behold, the people are sinning against the Lord by eating with the blood." And he said, "You have dealt treacherously. Roll a great stone to me here." So the battle and the chase from Michmash to Aijalon was a distance of about 16 miles. The army may have hurried to the end of the battle because they had become so hungry while pursuing the enemy. The people were so incredibly hungry that all thought of decorum and obedience to the Lord left their heads. You know, as a side note, typically the animal would have been suspended to drain the blood before being eaten. But notice where the animals were killed and where the animals were eaten, on the ground. So instead of eating the honey that was on the ground, they sinned and ate the blood that was on the ground. They were so hungry that they did not care in the slightest as to how they were supposed to prepare the food to eat. You know, similarly, have you ever been so tired that you just went to bed in your day clothes? Or have you ever been so hungry that you didn't care what you ate? I remember there was one time I hadn't eaten any food in 3 days, and I saw this one lady eating these unflavored cardboard rice cakes, and they looked so good. When you haven't eaten and you feel as though you are starving, you're willing to do almost anything. When driven to extremes, people become willing to do many things that they would not even consider under normal circumstances. And here, even Saul of all people, who has not been following the Lord all that well lately, is shocked at the behavior of the people. He's going to set up a place to give the men an opportunity to prepare the food according to the Lord's instructions. Now, there are many great places throughout the Old Testament a great many places throughout the Old Testament that prohibit eating blood. One of the prohibitions in the book of Leviticus may give us a little bit of insight into the exact reasoning behind the prohibition to begin with. Look at Leviticus 19:26. God telling the people, you shall not eat any flesh with the blood in it. You shall not interpret omens or tell fortunes. Notice here in this verse, the Lord seems to link the act of eating meat with blood still in it to the pagan practices of divination and sorcery. History tells us that throughout the world, specifically, especially in this part of the world and in this part of history, people sought to obtain special powers from the very one of whom belonged the meat and the blood when they consumed it. So the prohibition against eating meat with blood still in it may not have been for dietary reasons, but more likely to not be confused or associated with those whose religious practices were of the most evil. Now let's go back to 1 Samuel and take a look at how Saul tried to get the people back on track following the Lord's word on this specific issue. Verse 34. And Saul said, disperse yourselves among the people and say to them, let every man bring his ox or his sheep and slaughter them here and eat. And do not sin against the Lord by eating with the blood. So every one of the people brought his ox with him that night, and they slaughtered them there. And Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first altar that he built to the Lord. So Saul provided a large stone to give the people an elevated surface from which to kill the animals and to drain the blood. Saul, who had violated the word of the Lord in front of his men, was now attempting to keep his men from violating the word of the Lord. The specific instruction from Saul was for the men to be prevented from sinning against the Lord. So even though his spiritual condition was presently turned away from the Lord himself, he still had some part of him that knew what he should be doing. He should be following the Lord, and he should be leading the nation to follow after the Lord as well. So at least here at the beginning of his reign, he's still trying to honor the Lord. Well, at least a little bit. You know, maybe eating the blood was a step too far for him to endure. He hadn't been bothered by his own disobedience after just a week, but the men eating blood would not be tolerated. So Saul builds an altar to worship the Lord. Altars were built throughout the Old Testament for various reasons, all for worship, but many times also for a significant moment. I mean, think about Noah's altar after the flood, or every time Abram moved to a new place, he built an altar. Moses' altar after the water from the rock and the deliverance from the Amalekites. Joshua's altar after Ai's defeat, and so on and so on. And so even though Saul was walking outside of the Spirit of God, the Lord had rescued and delivered he and the people in the most remarkable way. So even Saul takes time to acknowledge and worship the Lord. And that ought to be really a great conviction for all of us, that we should always take time to acknowledge and worship the Lord throughout every moment, if for no other reason than his rescue and deliverance of us through our salvation. So thank you for joining us tonight on our Wednesday night study as we are walking through the Old Testament, 1 Samuel 14 here. I hope you'll come back next week as we keep taking a look at this and see how Saul discovers what Jonathan had done in eating the honey there in the forest. So join us next week and continue to explore God's Word every single day.